The moment I saw the neon orange violation notice taped to my front door, I knew my Tuesday was about to go sideways. I had just gotten home from my shift at the automotive shop, grease still under my fingernails, and there it was, glaring at me like a traffic citation from hell. The Pinewood Springs Homeowners Association had decided that the sage green I'd painted my shutters 3 weeks ago violated their aesthetic guidelines, and they were fining me $500. I stood there on my porch in Gilbert, Arizona, staring at the paper in disbelief. The desert sun beat down on my neck as I read the formal language, the threats of escalating fines, the mention of possible legal action. $500 for paint. Paint that I'd specifically chosen after reviewing the HOA's approved color palette, which clearly listed sage green as acceptable for exterior accents. My name is Ryan Bradford, and I'd lived in Pinewood Springs for exactly 8 months. I'd bought this modest 3-bedroom house with my savings, proud to finally own something of my own at 32 years old. The neighborhood was nice enough, with neat rows of tan and beige houses, perfectly manicured lawns, and strict rules about everything from mailbox height to the type of rocks you could use in your landscaping. I'd known about the HOA when I bought the place, but the previous owner had assured me they were reasonable and rarely caused problems. That assessment was turning out to be wildly inaccurate. I pulled out my phone and called the number listed on the violation notice. A woman answered on the third ring, her voice dripping with that particular brand of passive-aggressive sweetness that immediately set my teeth on edge. "Pinewood Springs HOA, this is Patricia speaking. How may I help you?" "Yeah, hi. This is Ryan Bradford from 2847 Desert Willow Lane. I just got a violation notice about my shutters, and I think there's been a mistake." "Oh?" Her tone shifted, becoming clipped and formal. "What seems to be the problem, Mr. Bradford?" "The notice says my sage green shutters are a violation, but I pulled the color from your approved list. I've got the documentation right here that shows sage green is acceptable for exterior accents." There was a pause, and I could hear papers rustling. "Mr. Bradford, the color you used is not the approved shade. Our president, Mrs. Deborah Whitmore, personally inspected your property and determined that your paint choice is too vibrant and does not match the community standards." Too vibrant? It's sage green. It's literally one of the most subdued colors you can pick. Nevertheless, the violation stands. You have 30 days to repaint the shutters in an approved color, or the fine will increase to $1,000. Additionally, you'll be assessed a daily penalty of $50 until the issue is resolved. My grip tightened on the phone. "I want to speak to someone about appealing this. This is ridiculous." "You may submit a written appeal to the board, which meets on the third Thursday of each month. Your appeal will be reviewed, and you'll receive a response within 15 business days." "The third Thursday? That's 3 weeks away, and then 15 business days after that? You're telling me I could be hit with thousands in fines before I even get a hearing?" "Those are the procedures outlined in your HOA agreement, Mr. Bradford. I suggest you familiarize yourself with them. Is there anything else I can help you with today?" I hung up without answering, my blood pressure rising. This was insane. I'd done everything right, followed their rules, and now some woman named Deborah Whitmore had decided my paint was too vibrant and was threatening me with escalating fines that could total thousands of dollars. I went inside and dug out my HOA documents, the thick packet I'd barely glanced at during closing. As I read through the covenants and restrictions, my stomach sank. The language was vague and gave the board almost unlimited discretion to determine what constituted a violation. There were provisions for fines, liens, and even foreclosure if dues and penalties went unpaid. The appeal process was exactly as Patricia had described, designed to drag out for weeks while fines accumulated. But there had to be something I could do. I wasn't going to let some power-hungry HOA president shake me down over paint that was clearly within their guidelines. The next morning, I took off work early and drove to the HOA management office, a small suite in a strip mall near the freeway. The waiting area was sterile and cold, with motivational posters about community pride and working together. A receptionist, with too much makeup and a name tag that read Cynthia, looked up from her computer with barely concealed annoyance. "I need to speak with someone about a violation notice," I said, keeping my voice level. "Do you have an appointment?" No, but this is urgent. I'm being fined for something that shouldn't be a violation, and I need to get this resolved before the penalties start adding up. She sighed heavily, as if I'd just asked her to move a mountain. Let me see if Mrs. Whitmore is available. She picked up the phone, spoke in hushed tones, then hung up and gestured to a hallway. Second door on the right. I walked down the corridor, my work boots squeaking on the linoleum, and knocked on the indicated door. A voice called out for me to enter, and I stepped into an office that could only be described as a shrine to suburban authority. Plaques covered the walls, certificates of appreciation, photos of Deborah Whitmore at various community events, and a large framed copy of the HOA covenants. The woman herself sat behind a heavy desk, mid-50s, with helmet-like blonde hair, pearls, and a blazer that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. She looked me up and down with obvious disapproval, her lips pursing as she took in my work clothes and the general fact of my existence. Mr. Bradford, I assume? That's right. I'm here about the violation notice. Yes, the shutters. Quite an eyesore, I must say. I noticed them during my routine inspection of the neighborhood. The color is far too bold for our community aesthetic. I pulled out my phone and opened the photos I'd taken of the HOA color palette from their website. This is your approved list. Sage green is right here, number 43. That's the exact color I used. I can show you the paint receipt. She barely glanced at the screen. The approved list is a guideline, Mr. Bradford. The board retains the right to determine whether any specific application meets our standards. In your case, it does not. That's completely arbitrary. How am I supposed to know what's acceptable if you can just decide after the fact that something doesn't meet your standards? Perhaps you should have sought pre-approval before making changes to your property. That's what responsible homeowners do. The guidelines don't say pre-approval is required for repainting existing features in approved colors. They don't say it isn't required either. She folded her hands on the desk, her expression smug. Mr. Bradford, I understand you're new to the community, so let me be clear. Pinewood Springs has standards. We've worked very hard to maintain property values and a certain quality of life here. When residents like yourself make unauthorized changes, it affects everyone. Now, you can either repaint the shutters in an acceptable color, or you can continue to accrue fines. The choice is yours. I could feel my face getting hot. I want to appeal this to the board. That's your right. Submit your appeal in writing and we'll review it at next month's meeting. And in the meantime, I'm stuck with fines piling up. Again, that's your choice. You could repaint and avoid the issue entirely. With paint that's already on your approved list. With paint that meets our aesthetic standards, which your current choice does not. She stood, signaling the meeting was over. I have other appointments, Mr. Bradford. If there's nothing else, Cynthia can provide you with the appeal forms on your way out. Yeah, I left the office seething, grabbed the forms from the uninterested receptionist, and sat in my truck for 10 minutes trying to calm down. This woman was unbelievable. The more I thought about it, the more convinced I became that something else was going on. This wasn't just about paint. This felt personal, like she was targeting me for some reason. Over the next few days, I did some digging. I talked to my neighbors, carefully feeling out their experiences with the HOA. Most were reluctant to say much, clearly afraid of retaliation, but I pieced together a troubling picture. Deborah Whitmore had been HOA president for 6 years, running unopposed in every election. She was known for aggressive enforcement of violations, particularly against newer residents. Several people mentioned that her own property had multiple features that seemed to violate the same rules she enforced against others, but no one wanted to file a complaint. One neighbor, an older guy named Tom who lived 3 houses down, was more willing to talk. He invited me over for a beer one evening, and we sat on his back patio as the sun set over the desert. "She's been after me about my tree for 2 years, he said, gesturing to a large mesquite in his backyard. "Says it's overgrown and needs to be trimmed. I've had 3 different arborists tell me it's perfectly healthy and doesn't need trimming. But she keeps sending violation notices, keeps threatening fines. I finally just started ignoring them." "What happened?" "Nothing yet. I think she knows if she actually follows through, I'll lawyer up and make it a problem. But she's worn down plenty of other people. The Johnsons 2 streets over ended up selling their house because they couldn't deal with her anymore. She fined them into oblivion over their garage door. Their garage door? It was white. She said it needed to be tan to match the house. They said it came that way when they bought the place. Didn't matter. She hit them with fines, and when they didn't pay, she filed a lien. They eventually just gave up and moved. That caught my attention. She can file a lien. Oh yeah, it's in the HOA docs. If you don't pay fines and dues, they can put a lien on your property. If it gets bad enough, they can even foreclose. I felt cold despite the warm evening air. That's insane. That's HOA law in Arizona. They've got a lot of power, and Deborah knows it. She's used it to push out anyone who challenges her or doesn't fall in line. Someone needs to stop her. Tom laughed bitterly. Good luck. People have tried. She's got the rest of the board in her pocket, and she's very good at documenting everything to make it look legitimate. Even if you lawyer up, it's expensive, and she's got the HOA's legal fund to draw on. I went home that night more determined than ever. I wasn't going to be pushed out of my house by some petty tyrant. I'd worked too hard to own this place. If Deborah Whitmore wanted a fight, she was going to get one. I spent the next week preparing my appeal, documenting everything meticulously. I took photos of the shutters from every angle, printed out the HOA color guidelines with sage green clearly listed, included the paint receipt showing the exact color code, and even got a letter from the paint store confirming it matched the approved shade. I submitted the appeal 2 weeks before the board meeting, as required, and waited. In the meantime, I started noticing things about Deborah's own property. Her house was at the entrance to the neighborhood, a large 2-story with a professionally landscaped yard. As I drove past each day, I began documenting violations that, according to the HOA's own rules, should have resulted in notices. Her grass was frequently over the 4-inch height limit. She had decorative solar lights along her walkway that weren't on the approved list of outdoor lighting. Her house numbers were brass, while the guidelines specified dark bronze or black. None of it was major, but it was evidence of the double standard. I photographed everything, noting dates and times. The board meeting was held on a Thursday evening in the community clubhouse, a bland building near the neighborhood pool. I arrived 15 minutes early, clutching a folder with all my documentation. A handful of other residents trickled in, most looking resigned or annoyed. Deborah sat at a table at the front of the room with 4 other board members, all middle-aged and prosperous-looking. She saw me and her expression hardened. The meeting started with general business, minutes from the last meeting, financial reports that seemed designed to bore everyone into submission. Finally, after 40 minutes, they got to appeals. First on the agenda is Mr. Ryan Bradford, regarding violation notice 23-47, Deborah announced, her tone making it clear this was a waste of her time. I stood and walked to the front, setting my folder on the table. Thank you for hearing my appeal. As I've documented here, the paint color I used for my shutters is sage green, specifically number 43 on the HOA's approved color list. I have the paint receipt, photographs, and a letter from the paint retailer confirming this. The violation notice is incorrect. I handed copies of everything to the board members. They passed them around, most barely glancing at the materials. One woman, younger than the others with dark hair and a professional demeanor, actually read through the documents carefully. Deborah didn't even look at what I'd provided. Mr. Bradford, as I've explained, the approved list is a guideline. The shade you chose, regardless of what number it corresponds to, is not appropriate for our community aesthetic. It's too vibrant and draws excessive attention. By what standard? I asked. If the color is on the approved list, what makes it too vibrant? Do you have objective criteria? The board's judgment is the criteria, she said sharply. We know what maintains property values in this community. The dark-haired board member spoke up. Mrs. Whitmore, I'm looking at his photos and the color sample. It looks like a standard sage green to me. I'm not sure I see the issue. Deborah shot her a look that could have melted steel. Susan, we've been over this. Consistent enforcement requires us to maintain discretion over applications of the guidelines. But if he used an approved color, the color as applied is not appropriate. That's my assessment as president, and I'm recommending the board uphold the violation. Susan looked like she wanted to argue, but backed down. The other 3 board members, who hadn't said a word, nodded in agreement with Deborah. I tried another angle. I'd like to point out that there are multiple violations visible at other properties in the neighborhood, including the president's own home. If we're concerned about consistent enforcement, shouldn't all violations be addressed equally? The room went silent. Deborah's face flushed. Are you seriously making accusations, Mr. Bradford? I'm pointing out facts. Your grass exceeds the height limit regularly. You have unapproved solar lights. Your house numbers are the wrong color. All of those are violations according to the same guidelines you're using to fine me. How dare you, she hissed. I am the president of this board. I've dedicated countless volunteer hours to maintaining this community. You've lived here 5 minutes and think you can waltz in here and challenge my authority? I'm not challenging authority. I'm asking for equal enforcement of the rules. One of the other board members, a heavy-set man in his 60s, cleared his throat. I think we should table this discussion. It's getting heated. Let's review everything and vote at next month's meeting. No, Deborah said firmly. We vote now. All in favor of upholding the violation? 3 hands went up immediately. Susan hesitated, then slowly raised hers. Deborah looked triumphant. The violation is upheld. Mr. Bradford, you have 30 days from the original notice date to repaint. That gives you 2 weeks. Failure to comply will result in escalating fines and potential legal action. This meeting is adjourned. I stood there, stunned, as the board members began packing up their materials. Susan caught my eye and mouthed, "Sorry," before hurrying out. The other residents who'd been watching dispersed quickly, clearly not wanting to be noticed. I walked out into the parking lot, my hands shaking with anger and frustration. This was a kangaroo court. Deborah ran the board like a dictatorship, and no amount of evidence or reason was going to change the outcome. She wanted me to repaint, and she was going to make it happen regardless of whether I was right. But I wasn't done. Not even close. The next morning, I called a lawyer. Her name was Michelle Santos, and she specialized in HOA disputes. Her office was in downtown Phoenix, a sleek high-rise with a view of the mountains. She listened to my story, reviewed my documentation, and leaned back in her chair. "You've got a decent case that the violation is arbitrary and capricious," she said. "The problem is, HOA law in Arizona heavily favors the association. They have broad discretion, and judges are reluctant to second-guess their decisions unless there's clear evidence of discrimination or abuse of power." What about the violations at Deborah's own property? Selective enforcement can be relevant, but it's hard to prove without more. You'd need to show a pattern of targeting or demonstrate that she's systematically ignoring violations by certain people while hammering others. How do I do that? You'd need access to HOA records, violation notices, board meeting minutes, financial records. The problem is, they're not going to just hand those over. You'd have to request them formally, and even then, they can fight it. What are my options? She sighed. Honestly, the most cost-effective thing is probably to repaint the shutters and move on. Fighting this could cost you thousands in legal fees, and there's no guarantee you'll win. What if I don't repaint and they file a lien? Then you definitely need to fight it because a lien can lead to foreclosure if it's not resolved. But at that point, you're playing defense, which is harder. I left her office feeling defeated. The system was rigged against me. Deborah had all the power, and the only way to fight back was to spend money I didn't have on a legal battle I might not win. But as I sat in my truck in the parking garage, something occurred to me. Michelle had mentioned needing access to HOA records. In Arizona, HOAs were required to make certain records available to homeowners. I couldn't remember the exact rules, but I knew there was a law about it. If I could get my hands on the HOA's records, maybe I could find evidence of the patterns Michelle had mentioned. I spent that evening researching Arizona HOA law. Statute 33-1805 laid out the requirements for record inspection. Homeowners had the right to examine the association's records, including meeting minutes, financial statements, contracts, and violations. The HOA had to make them available within 10 business days of a written request. I drafted a formal letter requesting access to the last 3 years of board meeting minutes, all violation notices issued during that period, and the HOA's financial records, including contracts with vendors and payments to board members. I sent it certified mail the next morning. 8 days later, I got a response. It was a letter from an attorney representing the HOA, informing me that my request was overly broad and burdensome, and that I'd need to narrow the scope before they'd consider compliance. It was a delaying tactic, obviously, but it told me something important. They didn't want me looking at those records. I revised the request, being more specific about dates and document types, and sent it again. This time, they waited the full 10 days before responding with a partial production. They sent me meeting minutes, heavily redacted, and a list of violations that was clearly incomplete. Nothing about finances or vendor contracts. I filed a complaint with the Arizona Department of Real Estate, which oversaw HOAs, pointing out that the HOA was violating state law by refusing to provide the requested records. They opened an investigation, which I knew could take months, but it was something. In the meantime, my deadline to repaint was approaching. I'd gotten another violation notice, this one informing me that my fine had increased to $1,000 and that I was now being charged $50 per day. If I didn't repaint within the next week, they'd begin lien proceedings. I made a decision. I wasn't going to repaint. Let them file the lien. If this was going to end up in court anyway, I wanted it to be on my terms, not theirs. The lien notice arrived 2 weeks later. It was a formal legal document stating that the HOA had placed a lien on my property for unpaid fines and penalties totaling $2,300. I had 30 days to pay or dispute the lien before they could proceed with foreclosure. I called Michelle Santos again. They filed the lien. I want to fight it. Are you sure? This is going to get expensive. I'm sure. Something's wrong here, and I'm going to find out what it is. She agreed to take the case. We filed a lawsuit in Maricopa County Superior Court challenging the lien and the underlying violations as arbitrary, capricious, and in violation of the HOA's own governing documents. We also included a cause of action for selective enforcement based on the violations I'd documented at Deborah's property. The discovery process started, and that's when things got interesting. As part of the lawsuit, we were entitled to subpoena documents from the HOA, and they couldn't refuse without a court order. Michelle requested everything: meeting minutes, violation records, financial statements, bank records, contracts, emails, and communications between board members. The HOA fought us at every turn, filing motions to quash the subpoenas and limit discovery. But the judge, a no-nonsense woman named Helen Martinez, wasn't having it. She ordered the HOA to produce the documents within 30 days or face sanctions. When the records finally arrived, it took me 3 days to go through everything, and what I found was stunning. Deborah Whitmore had been using the HOA as her personal piggy bank. Over the past 3 years, she'd authorized payments to a landscaping company called Desert Bloom Services, totaling over $120,000. The work was supposedly for common area maintenance, but the invoices were vague and didn't specify what work was actually done. I did some digging on Desert Bloom Services. The company was registered to a man named Richard Whitmore, Deborah's husband. The landscaping wasn't the only issue. There were payments to a property management consulting firm that had received $40,000 in fees, despite the fact that the HOA already employed a management company. That consulting firm was owned by Deborah's sister. There were also selective enforcement patterns that were impossible to ignore. Of the 300 violation notices issued in the past 3 years, over 60% had been sent to homeowners who'd lived in the neighborhood for less than 2 years. Long-term residents, particularly those friendly with Deborah, rarely received violations even when they had obvious issues. And then there was the smoking gun. In the board meeting minutes from 18 months ago, there was a discussion about changing the approved color palette to be more restrictive. Susan, the board member who'd seemed sympathetic during my appeal, had argued against it, saying it would be unfair to residents who'd already painted using the current guidelines. Deborah had pushed it through anyway, with a vote of 4-1. But here's the thing. The revised color palette had never been published or sent to residents. It existed only in the board minutes, which meant Deborah was enforcing rules that homeowners didn't even know existed. I couldn't believe it. This wasn't just a power-hungry HOA president. This was fraud. Deborah had been funneling HOA funds to her family members and selectively enforcing fake rules to push out residents who might question her authority. Michelle was equally stunned when I showed her what I'd found. This is criminal. We need to report this. To who? The Arizona Attorney General's office. They prosecute fraud cases involving HOAs. This is embezzlement, self-dealing, breach of fiduciary duty. She could go to prison. We prepared a comprehensive report documenting everything and sent it to the Attorney General's office. We also amended our lawsuit to include claims for fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, and violations of Arizona's nonprofit corporation laws. The HOA's attorney tried to get the case dismissed, arguing that our claims were baseless. But when we presented the evidence in a hearing, including the payments to Deborah's family members and the unpublished rule changes, the judge denied the motion and set a trial date. That's when things started moving fast. The Attorney General's office opened a criminal investigation. Within 2 weeks, they'd subpoenaed the HOA's bank records and interviewed several current and former board members. Susan, the board member who'd been sympathetic, apparently told them everything, confirming that Deborah had pressured the board to approve payments to her husband's company and that she'd been aware the color palette changes hadn't been properly published. The investigation went public 3 months after I'd first received that violation notice about my shutters. The local news picked up the story, running a piece about the HOA president accused of embezzling over $150,000. My name wasn't mentioned, but everyone in the neighborhood knew I was involved. The reaction was swift. A group of residents filed a petition to recall the entire board. Others came forward with their own stories of harassment and arbitrary fines. Tom, my neighbor with the mesquite tree, organized a meeting at the clubhouse where over 100 homeowners showed up to demand accountability. Deborah went into hiding, refusing to comment or attend board meetings. The other board members, facing potential legal liability, started cooperating with investigators. The HOA's attorney withdrew from representing them, citing conflicts of interest. The criminal charges were filed in August. Deborah was indicted on 15 counts of fraud, embezzlement, and breach of fiduciary duty. Her husband, Richard, was charged as an accomplice for his role in the landscaping scheme. Deborah's sister, who ran the consulting firm, was also indicted. The trial was scheduled for November, and I was called as a witness. The prosecution walked me through everything: the initial violation notice, my attempts to appeal, the discovery of the financial irregularities. The defense attorney tried to paint me as a disgruntled homeowner with an axe to grind, but the documentary evidence was overwhelming. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Guilty on all counts. Deborah was sentenced to 5 years in prison, though the judge allowed her to remain free pending appeal. Richard got 3 years for his role in the landscaping fraud. The sister got probation and was ordered to repay the $40,000 her consulting firm had received. The civil case was settled a month later. The HOA agreed to remove the lien from my property, refund all fines I'd paid, and cover my legal fees, which had climbed to just over $30,000. They also agreed to implement new governance procedures, including term limits for board members, mandatory financial audits, and a transparent process for rule changes. As part of the settlement, I insisted on one additional term. The sage green shutters stayed. The HOA agreed and even issued a formal letter acknowledging that the violation had been improper. The neighborhood changed after that. New board members were elected, people who actually cared about serving the community rather than wielding power. The arbitrary enforcement stopped. Violation notices became rare and were issued only for genuine problems. People started attending board meetings, paying attention to what was happening. Tom threw a barbecue to celebrate, inviting half the neighborhood. We stood in his backyard under that mesquite tree Deborah had tried to make him cut down, drinking beer and swapping stories about the whole ordeal. "You know," he said, raising his bottle, "I never thought anyone would actually stand up to her. Most people just gave up." "I almost did," I admitted. "It would have been easier to just repaint and move on." "But you didn't? And now she's going to prison, and the rest of us can actually live in peace." "Honestly, I just wanted to paint my shutters," he laughed. "And you did, in the most expensive possible way." I couldn't argue with that. Between the legal fees, the time off work, and the stress, those sage green shutters had cost me more than any paint job had a right to. But it wasn't really about the paint. It was about the principle, about not letting someone abuse their power just because they could. The following spring, I was working in my front yard, planting some desert marigolds when a car pulled up. It was Susan, the former board member. She'd resigned after the scandal broke, saying she couldn't be part of an organization that had allowed such corruption to happen. "I wanted to apologize," she said, standing at the edge of my driveway. "I knew something was wrong with Deborah, but I didn't have the courage to stand up to her. I should have voted with you at that meeting." "You were in a tough spot," I said. "She had everyone intimidated." "Still, what you did took guts. A lot of people would have walked away. A lot of people did walk away. The Johnsons, and who knows how many others." She nodded. "I've been thinking about running for the board again. Someone needs to make sure this doesn't happen again." "You'd have my vote," she smiled. "That means a lot. And for what it's worth, your shutters look great." I glanced up at them, those sage green shutters that had started this whole mess. They did look good. They complemented the tan of the house and brought out the green in the desert landscaping, exactly like I'd planned when I painted them. Life in Pinewood Springs settled into a comfortable rhythm after that. The new board was transparent and reasonable. The neighborhood felt less oppressive, less like everyone was constantly looking over their shoulder waiting for a violation notice. Property values actually went up, contrary to Deborah's dire warnings about what would happen without her strict enforcement. I ran into Patricia, the receptionist from the HOA office, at a grocery store one afternoon. She'd quit her job shortly after the scandal broke, unable to handle the stress and negative attention. "I'm sorry I was so unhelpful when you called that first time," she said, looking genuinely remorseful. "Deborah had us all terrified. If we didn't back her up on everything, she'd threaten our jobs." "It's okay. I understand." "No, it's not okay. I watched her bully people for years and didn't say anything. I should have." "Well, it's over now. She can't hurt anyone anymore." Patricia nodded, but she still looked troubled. The thing is, she really believed she was doing the right thing. She thought she was protecting property values and maintaining standards. In her mind, she was the hero. That stuck with me. It was easy to paint Deborah as a villain, and she certainly deserved the consequences of her actions. But Patricia was right in a way. Deborah had convinced herself that her behavior was justified, that the rules didn't apply to her because she was serving a greater good. It was a reminder of how easy it is for anyone with a little power to rationalize abuse. The criminal appeal process dragged on for over a year. Deborah's attorneys argued that the prosecution had overreached, that her actions were civil matters rather than criminal ones. But the appellate court upheld the conviction, finding that the evidence of intentional fraud and embezzlement was overwhelming. Her sentence was affirmed, and she finally reported to prison in March of the following year. By that time, I'd mostly moved on with my life. The whole experience had been exhausting, but it had also taught me something important about standing up for yourself, even when the system seems rigged against you. I'd made friends in the neighborhood, real friends, people who'd gone through the same struggles with the HOA, and were grateful someone had finally put a stop to it. I did some work on the house, with proper approval from the new board, which they granted without drama. I added some pavers to the backyard, updated the front landscaping, and even repainted the front door in navy blue, which was definitely on the approved list and which the board confirmed in writing before I started. Tom became a good friend. We'd have dinner every couple of weeks, either at his place or mine, and talk about work, sports, life. He lived in Pinewood Springs for 15 years and had seen the neighborhood go through various phases, but he said the current environment was the best it had been. "You know what's funny?" he said one evening as we sat on my back patio watching the sunset. "Property values are higher now than when Deborah was running things. All that talk about strict enforcement being necessary to maintain values was garbage. People want to live in a place where they're treated fairly," I said. "That's worth more than whether every blade of grass is exactly 4 inches. Amen to that." Michelle Santos, my attorney, sent me a final bill showing that the HOA had paid every cent of my legal fees as part of the settlement. She included a note thanking me for my patience during the process and saying that my case had been one of the most satisfying of her career. "Not often we get to take down someone who really deserves it and recover full fees," she wrote. "You should be proud of what you accomplished." I was proud, though it felt strange to take pride in something that had started as such a frustrating experience. But I'd learned that sometimes fighting back is worth it, even when the odds seem impossible. Even when everyone tells you to just give up and accept the injustice. The Arizona Attorney General's office sent me a letter as well, thanking me for bringing the fraud to their attention and noting that my case had led them to investigate several other HOAs across the state. Apparently, Deborah's scheme wasn't unique. There were other board members in other communities using similar tactics to enrich themselves at the expense of homeowners. One case in Scottsdale involved a board president who'd been funneling money to a security company owned by his brother-in-law. Another, in Tempe, had a treasurer who'd been skimming dues for over a decade. The investigation I'd triggered had opened up a much larger can of worms, leading to reforms in how HOAs were overseen and audited. I never expected any of that when I painted my shutters that weekend in May. I just wanted to improve my house to make it feel more like home. Instead, I'd ended up exposing a criminal enterprise and helping to change how HOAs operated across the state. The irony wasn't lost on me. 2 years after the whole ordeal started, I was sitting on my porch on a Saturday morning, drinking coffee and reading the news on my tablet, when a moving truck pulled up at Deborah's old house. Her husband, Richard, had sold it after his conviction, unable to keep up with the mortgage while paying legal fees and restitution. A young couple got out of a car behind the truck, looking excited and a little overwhelmed. I walked over to introduce myself. "Welcome to the neighborhood. I'm Ryan, right over there at 2847. The man shook my hand. "Marcus, this is my wife Jennifer. We're excited to be here." "First time in an HOA?" "Yeah, we read all the documents and they seemed reasonable. Is it a good community?" I thought about how to answer that. "It is now. There was some trouble a while back, but it got sorted out. The current board is great. Just make sure you stay involved, go to meetings, pay attention to what's happening. That's the best way to keep things running smoothly." Jennifer looked curious. "What kind of trouble?" "Long story. I'll tell you sometime over a beer. But the short version is, the old board president was corrupt and got sent to prison. We've got good people running things now." They both looked shocked. Marcus recovered first. "Good to know. We'll definitely stay involved." As I walked back to my house, I realized that was the legacy of everything that had happened. Not just that Deborah had been held accountable, but that people in the neighborhood were now engaged and vigilant. They understood that HOAs could be tools for genuine community improvement or weapons for petty tyranny, depending on who was in charge and whether anyone was paying attention. My sage green shutters had faded slightly in the intense Arizona sun, taking on an even softer, more subdued tone. They looked perfect. Every time I pulled into my driveway and saw them, I felt a small sense of satisfaction. Not just because of the color, but because of what they represented, the right to make reasonable choices about your own property without being bullied or extorted. I got a letter from Deborah about 6 months into her prison sentence. It was forwarded through my attorney, since she wasn't allowed to contact me directly. In it, she claimed she'd never meant to hurt anyone, that she'd only been trying to maintain community standards, and that she'd made some mistakes in judgment, but didn't deserve to be in prison. She didn't apologize. Not once in the 3-page letter did she acknowledge that what she'd done was wrong. She blamed me for investigating her, blamed the Attorney General for prosecuting her, blamed the jury for convicting her. Everyone was at fault except herself. I didn't respond. There was nothing to say. Deborah had created her own reality where she was the victim, and no amount of evidence or argument was going to change that. She'd have to live with the consequences of her actions, whether she ever accepted responsibility or not. Michelle advised me to keep the letter, just in case, but I couldn't see what purpose it would serve. I filed it away in a box with all the other documents from the case, a box I hoped I'd never have to open again. Life went on. I got a promotion at work, managing a team at the automotive shop. I dated a woman named Felicia for a while, though it didn't work out. I adopted a dog, a rescue mutt named Copper, who loved to lie in the backyard and watch the birds. The house became truly mine, filled with my stuff, my choices, my life. Tom ran for the HOA board and won. He served 2 terms, helping to implement the governance reforms that had been part of my settlement. He was good at it, patient and fair, exactly the kind of person who should be running a community association. "I learned from the best," he said when I congratulated him on his election. "You showed us all how to fight back when something's wrong. I just wanted to keep my paint color. And you did, along with saving the neighborhood from a tyrant, Not bad for a weekend project. The story made the rounds in Arizona HOA circles. I got calls from other homeowners facing similar situations, asking for advice. I always told them the same thing. Document everything, know your rights, and don't be afraid to lawyer up if necessary. Most HOAs will back down when faced with someone who's willing to fight, because they know their authority is more limited than they like to pretend. A few cases went to court, and attorneys started citing my case as precedent for challenging arbitrary HOA enforcement. Michelle told me I'd become something of a folk hero in the HOA litigation community, which was both flattering and absurd. 3 years after painting my shutters, I finally felt like the whole ordeal was truly behind me. The legal bills were paid, Deborah was still in prison, the neighborhood was thriving, and my house was exactly how I wanted it. I'd survived what could have been a financial and emotional disaster, and come out stronger on the other side. I was working in the garage one afternoon when Marcus, the neighbor who'd bought Deborah's old house, came over with a question. He wanted to replace his mailbox, which was old and rusty, and wanted to know if he needed HOA approval. Check the guidelines, I said. If you're replacing it with the same style, you should be fine. If you're changing the design, submit a request to the board. They're pretty reasonable. Thanks. Hey, you never told me that story about what happened with the old board. I grabbed 2 beers from the garage fridge and gestured to the patio furniture. You got an hour? He settled into a chair. I've got all afternoon. So I told him everything, from that first orange violation notice through the investigation, the trial, and the settlement. He listened with increasing amazement, occasionally interrupting to ask questions or express disbelief. All that over shutters, he said when I finished. All that over shutters and power and greed. Deborah saw the HOA as her personal kingdom, and anyone who challenged her had to be crushed. Sounds like you did everyone a favor. I did myself a favor. The fact that it helped everyone else was a side effect. Still, Jennifer and I love it here. The HOA has been great, very responsive. None of the horror stories you hear about. Sounds like we have you to thank for that. Thank the people who stood up when it mattered. Susan, the board member who cooperated with investigators, Tom, who organized the recall, all the neighbors who came forward with their own stories. I just started the ball rolling. But I knew that wasn't entirely true. Someone had to be willing to take that first step, to challenge the system even when it seemed impossible. If I'd just repainted my shutters like Deborah demanded, she'd still be running the HOA, still funneling money to her family, still terrorizing residents who didn't fall in line. Sometimes doing the right thing is expensive and exhausting and seems completely crazy, but sometimes it's also necessary. Marcus left, thanking me again for the story and the advice. I sat on my patio as the evening cooled, copper at my feet, and looked at my house, my sage-green shutters, my navy blue door, my desert landscaping with its native plants and rocks. Every bit of it was mine, chosen by me, protected by law and principle. I thought about all the people living in HOAs across the country, dealing with their own Deborahs, their own arbitrary rules and petty tyrants. I hoped some of them would read about my case and find the courage to fight back, to document, to challenge, to demand accountability. Because that's the only way systems change, not from the top down, but from regular people refusing to accept injustice, even over something as small as paint color. The criminal justice system had worked in the end. Deborah was behind bars, her victims had been compensated, and reforms were in place to prevent similar fraud in the future. It wasn't a perfect outcome, nothing ever is, but it was justice. And my shutters were still sage green. I went inside as the sun set, copper following close behind. Tomorrow I'd go to work, come home, maybe have dinner with Tom or work on the yard. Normal life, the life I'd fought so hard to protect, the life that was mine, on my terms, in my house. Deborah Whitmore had tried to take that from me with threats and fines and legal intimidation. She'd had the power of the HOA behind her, the weight of contracts and covenants and Arizona law. She'd been certain she would win, because she always won. But she hadn't counted on someone stubborn enough to fight back, someone willing to dig deeper when something didn't make sense, someone who refused to be bullied into submission. She hadn't counted on me, and that had made all the difference.